Kia ora koutou. We've got a few people already logged on. Just be waiting for a few minutes past the hour as people trickle in before we start. Welcome everyone who's just coming in. We're just going to wait a sort of maybe one more minute before we get started today. Kia ora koutou. I think actually we'll get started. I'll begin with our karakia. Aio ki te rangi, aio ki te whenua, aio ki te katoa. Humie, huie, taekie.
Taekie.
Kia ora koutou. Thanks for joining us today. I expect a few more people might trickle in over the next few minutes. I'm Zoe. I am part of the Deep South Challenge engagement team. We're excited today to hear from the Innovations for Climate Adaptation team, which is a collaboration between the Centre for Sustainability and Manaaki Whenua, in one of the research projects funded by the Deep South Challenge. I suppose if we're here, we all understand that climate change adaptation is an unprecedented challenge for mana whenua and local authorities. In spite of those challenges, these groups are just getting on and doing it, experimenting and innovating, looking for a more just and robust adaptation and decision-making. This project has been learning from these innovators, and today we're going to hear about some of these lessons. The research team are going to present on 2 new publications. These offer guidance for Māori communities and councils who are just starting out on their climate adaptation journey. The core research team is comprised of Janet Stevenson, Mirata Kaparu, Sophie Bond and Graydon DeProse. And I am, along with multiple mana whenua organisations, councils and postgraduate students. And now I am going to hand over to Janet to begin her presentation.
Tēnā koutou katoa. Lovely to be with you today, and I'm really excited to be sharing some of our research from the Innovations for Climate Adaptation Research Project. As Zoe said, the core research team was myself, Merata, who's overseas at present, Sophie and Graydon, and we had some amazing young people working with us as well, both as student researchers and also based in their own communities. And in addition to that, we were really privileged to be working alongside a number of mana whenua research partners in 3 locations or 3 regions across Aotearoa, in South Taranaki with Te Kahui o Rauru, in the Bay of Plenty with the Makatu Iwi Collective and with Te Rere Kahia Marae Committee, and in Otago with Okaha and Kahihui Rapa ki Puketeraki. In those same regions, we were also working with councils, with regional and district or city councils. And in both those instances, we were tracking what they were doing to respond to climate change challenges by regularly going back and interviewing people every 6 months across 2 years, hearing about what they were doing, how successful or otherwise their innovations were, how they were working collectively together, and some of the learnings and challenges from that. What we were seeing was that for place responsible authorities, and I'll just unpack that, we used the term place responsible authorities to reflect the fact that in each of those regions, mana whenua have responsibility for place that comes from their whakapapa, their history, their connections to place, and those responsibilities are enduring over time. As well as that, the more recent in historical time, innovation of local authorities, councils, regional councils, and district councils have also other responsibilities for the same place. And climate change impacts are very much a place-based thing. They are specific to place and specific to people. And so these place-based authorities, whether they're mana whenua or councils, are actually responding to the people and the places that they are responsible for. But there are no established responsibilities, processes, or roles for such an unprecedented series of changes that are already being faced and are likely to be faced in the future. But what we found was, in the face of that, councils and mana whenua were just doing it, even though the law and policies very rarely are giving a lot of guidance as to what they should be doing. And so these innovations were what we were tracking. And in our research, we were really interested in what they were doing in terms of changes to practices, changes within the organisation, changes to governance, but also particularly how mana whenua organisations and local authorities could work more effectively together. And we were seeing some examples of this, and also barriers and enablers that could be addressed through upcoming reforms in law and policy, which at that point seem to be likely. We'll wait to see whether those are going to occur or not. And we have a number of outputs which apparently are going to be popped in, links are going to be popped into chat, so you can access these directly, at least the ones that are online. Here are some of them around just adaptation. What does that justice mean in relation to adaptation planning and decision making? These are all short policy relevant reports, which may be of interest to all of you. One on adaptation by mana whenua, initiatives, challenges, and working with councils. Another report in the middle there about how councils are adapting and innovating. One specifically around unsupported. And then the two reports that we're going to be talking about today, which are sort of the culmination of our research, talking about innovations for climate response by local authorities, and the kete whakaaro, which is around innovations by mana whenua. I'm going to focus initially on the kete whakaaro findings, and then Graydon and Sophie are going to talk about the council findings. So kete whakaaro has been developed in about the last 6 months by the research team and Māori research partners. So it's been a very much a collaboration as to the content of this. And our Māori research partners were really interested in both sharing with each other across the research project, but also sharing their experiences to help other iwi and hapu who are just starting on the process of responding to climate change. And here are some of the high-level findings that are discussed in this report. First of all, that climate response is very much about rangatiratanga. It's about leading climate change adaptation. It may be at the scale of the marae, at a kāinga level, at a hapu level, or at an iwi level, but it is about let's take control of our own future. Many of them are developing climate adaptation plans or strategies. Many of them are having input into council and government policies and actions through submissions, being on committees, being on governance groups, and so forth. And all of them are supporting new and emerging leaders in the climate adaptation space, especially young people, rangatahi. In terms of mātauranga, they are drawing on tribal knowledge of past and present climate change, often actively going out and seeking this across the communities. Many of them are monitoring environmental health of their taio using both tikanga and Western science methods. Many of them, if not all, are commissioning scientific reports on future local impacts of climate change so that they know how it's going to affect their particular rohi or their particular marae or kāinga. And all of them are holding wānanga to upskill their people on climate change and to share knowledge across their people. In terms of kaitiakitanga, they're going out there, actively working, physically doing stuff to rebuild the mauri of Te Taio, to create much more vital and healthier local environments, because they realise that climate change is going to be yet another impact that will start to really badly affect, even worse than at present, the environmental quality. And so what they're doing is to try and enhance the vitality and health of their forests, of their wetlands, of their rivers and their oceans, in order to prepare for the impacts of climate change. They're undertaking marae-based planning for climate change adaptation. So what do we do at the marae level? Undertaking hikoi with their people to reconnect, share stories and observe the changes that are already occurring in the environment so that they can understand what is happening. And again, supporting young people to become the next generation of kaitiaki. In terms of manaakitanga, they're ensuring their marae are ready for caring for people during extreme weather events. And as we know, marae are often the first call for supporting communities, both Māori communities and wider communities, during events like Cyclone Gabrielle. They're improving their water supplies for times of drought and developing food security, particularly around developing marakai, food gardens, and restoring mahinga kai. And finally, potahitanga. They're bringing people together at their marae, hapu and iwi levels to work on climate change issues. So not just their own people, but the wider community. They're also working across other hapu and iwi on shared challenges. So there's a lot of collaboration starting to emerge right across different hapu and iwi who share interests. They're working with and often leading climate actions with tangata tiriti, so the Pakeha community, very much a collaboration there across different projects, and also a number of collaborations with councils and government agencies. So those initiatives are completely impressive and exciting when we look at it, and the leadership is absolutely extraordinary. And central and local government can absolutely help with this. And this report here, this Adaptation by Mana Whenua Initiatives, Challenges and Working with Councils, is where some of those messages come across around how particularly local government can help. First of all, in recognising mana, recognising rangatiratanga, and absolutely recognising the capability of Māori communities to take leadership here, and supporting that in tangible and very practical ways. And some of that is around building partnerships, and some of that is around resourcing to support those responsibilities. And an example of that is a couple of councils that actually provide funding specifically to assist Māori communities to commission niwa reports to understand the direct impacts of climate change for those communities. It's made a real difference in their understanding about the implications of sea level rise and flooding. Obviously, new policies and legislation need to recognise the unique circumstances of Māori communities, including their specific histories, their lands that are remaining to them, and the lands that they have responsibility for, and their connections to place. And nowhere is this more urgent than in places where communities or marae or wahitapu are directly impacted by climate change, for example, erosion and flooding. And some of our communities are already planning for relocation of marae or kāinga, but there's very little in place to assist them in how that should take place in an appropriate way that recognises te tiriti responsibilities. And finally, learning from mana whenua to develop holistic approaches to building resilience to climate change. So that what I was talking about before, all of those things that are being undertaken by community can be inspiring for communities more generally, particularly around that very holistic approach. It's not just, do we build a seawall to protect this house, but it is, how can we work right across restoring te taio, developing relationships with people, and taking leadership and very, very strong collective action to build resilience to climate change. And just finally, in terms of the potential for central government response to these issues, collectively across the Māori organisations that we worked with in Innovations for Climate Adaptation, and also another research project that I'm involved in, Project Kāinga, which is also working with 7 Māori communities. We made this submission, which I will make available online if people are interested, that summarises what we think needs to be covered in the upcoming Climate Adaptation Act. And over now to Sophie and Graydon.
Thanks, Janet. Yeah, so Sophie and I will just cover some of the innovations happening in local government across the country. So next slide, please, Janet. So the first thing we kind of identified was the way local government has been gathering robust climate change information. And we identified 3 kind of broad ways councils have been gathering data to inform climate action and decision making. So the first one was through downscaled climate change risk assessments. So while the 3 case study regions we were looking at are all at different stages of their risk assessments, in all cases, the regional council took the lead in commissioning the data and then sharing that with territorial authorities. So these risk assessments were seen by most of our participants as the first key step, and they tended to follow the process of the National Climate Change Risk Assessment. Some of the key kind of questions or issues they were considering at the start of the risk assessments was including data formats and spatial resolution, and then how that data would actually be integrated into decision making across the council. So to manage some of these issues, our participants described how they, at the very start of the risk assessment process, they tried to ensure that the outputs would be in formats that would fit within existing council systems. So, the GIS and asset layers and that kind of stuff. The second key practice has been emissions inventories and profiles. So while approaches have differed across the councils we've been working with, it usually involved reviewing councils' operational emissions and or the kind of district or regional emissions to establish a bit of a baseline, and then identify actions that would reduce emissions most cost effectively. So lots of our participants talked about how, starting with council's operational emissions was a really pragmatic place to start because, especially if, because it was felt that elected members and staff felt that they could actually control those things and that they had a bit more of a mandate to act on them. Wider city or regional community emissions were seen as more difficult to lead on, but we did note that some councils like Dunedin City Council are attempting this. The third key action has been reorganising internally with councils. So all of our participants described what were at times pretty significant changes in their organisations related to climate considerations. So these included changes to reporting lines, work programs, identifying new capabilities and roles. And we noticed an increasing emphasis on prioritising different capabilities and expertise in new roles. So it would be things like, they'd be hiring for a Tauranga scientist, hiring for social scientists, and staff with engagement, relationship management, and risk management skills. So the 2 things that kind of came up that would further support this work was firstly guidance on communicating climate change risks to the public, and then clarifying the role and mandate of local government in mitigation, and that's beyond the kind of council's operational emissions. Next slide, please, Janet. So in terms of turning that information into climate action, we observed 2 main themes. So firstly, downscale climate risk assessments are starting to flow through to district and regional plans and in infrastructure investment. So for example, we heard examples of new building setback rules, minimum floor levels to reflect increasing risks from flooding, erosion, and sea level. So those have been introduced into district plans. And we also heard about new rules related to freshwater and land use in regional plans to take account of predicted climatic changes like rainfall and temperature. To integrate the climate change risk data into council processes, the general consensus from most of our participants was that there was no point in reinventing the wheel. So what this meant practically is that for most of our case study councils, they were plugging that risk assessment data into existing council processes and committees, rather than setting up kind of new ones that were focused on climate processes. And that was just seen as a really pragmatic way. Lots of them were talking about how stretched they were, lack of resourcing, and especially over the last years, it's been lots of staffing difficulties in recruiting and retaining staff. So that was kind of a pragmatic way to deal with lots of those concerns. The second kind of key way to turn info into action has been using the emissions inventories and profiles and using those to start to inform investment in mitigation and adaptation through long-term plans and annual plans. So examples range from relatively straightforward things like replacing old lights with LEDs, electrifying vehicle fleets, and maintenance plans that account for more extreme weather events, to kind of larger, more complex things like new business cases for organic waste diversion from landfill, large-scale native planting on council-owned land, and nature-based solutions to create carbon sinks and hopefully earn carbon credits. So our participants identified 5 key changes that were needed at central government level to support their work. And these actually reflect a whole bunch of other recommendations that have come through in recent reports, expert panels, that kind of thing over the last few years. So we've got here clarifying resource process and resourcing for adaptation, especially retreat for private property. Big questions about that. Revising existing use rights in the RMA in relation to climate change. Big challenges around that. Strengthen the ability to decline development that is high risk to reduce future costs and stranded assets. And then prohibit litigation against plan changes where robust climate change assessment processes have been used. And then finally, new revenue instruments and funding for local government. So our participants cautioned that much of their work to date has been focused on gathering information, which has been funded through LTP processes. And they noted that the actual harder work of prioritising and funding the actual adaptation work hasn't really started in most cases. And it was still so unclear who's going to pay for that, especially where it exceeds council's budget, and also what national framework will support decision making when the more contentious questions arise in due course. Over to you, Sophie.
Kia ora, thank you, Graydon. I'm going to shift gear a little bit and talk more about local authority relationships and climate response. So Janet talked about what mana whenua are doing, the fantastic work that mana whenua were doing in relation to climate response. This is more focused on communities and mana whenua relationships with councils specifically. So there's a number of challenges. Graydon's highlighted some of them, but just to kind of encapsulate 5 key ones that came through our research, the lack of clarity around mana whenua relationships with council in relation to Te Tiriti o Waitangi is a key one, and that was highlighted in the Future for Local Government report that came out last year as well. Another key challenge is the legacy of past poor relationships. We know with any relationship that past poor actions or actions that have harmed one member of the relationship ends up coming back and being hard to move beyond or needs work to move beyond. And that's absolutely the case in relation to mana whenua and local government as well. But often local government doesn't necessarily see it in quite the same way, or is more institutionalized in their approaches to those relationships, which differs from the perspective of mana whenua. So understanding the past and understanding those histories, as Janet said, is absolutely crucial. Sometimes the structure of local government doesn't make working with mana whenua particularly easy. So there are dimensions to that as well. Time and resourcing is also always an issue, especially where in the past, this is starting to shift, but certainly often and in the past, mana whenua involvement in local government decision-making or processes like plan making, all of those sorts of things are treated as kind of mahi araha or volunteer time, and that needs to be resourced in order to maintain that input and support that input and recognise the value of that input as well in a more partnership-oriented way. And then lastly, a lot of our participants talked about the unevenness of the level of kind of what we've described as cultural acumen, the capability of council staff and elected members to work in Māori spaces. And if the relationship is poor or has been challenging in the past, any kind of offence because of that lack of awareness or knowledge of working within Māori spaces can exacerbate those often quite precarious relationships because of past events. It's not to do with a lack of goodwill, it's more to do with a lack of capability and knowledge. So those are some of the key challenges that came up. Despite these challenges that were noted, there's a whole lot of change that's occurred in the way that councils, that we found in the way that councils are working with mana whenua. There's examples of more formalised relationships, memorandums of understanding with mana whenua, groups or organisations that establish guidelines for working practices, roles, responsibilities, funding, resourcing, all of those things. This was particularly the case down here in Ōtepoti with the consultancy, the Ngaitahu Consultancy Ōkaha, who have formal relationships with many of the district and city councils and the regional council here. That's facilitated resourcing FTE in some instances on significant pieces of statutory planning work, like the Land and Water Plan or a policy statement or that kind of thing. So it facilitates a whole series of ways of working differently that really brings mana whenua into particularly resource management processes, but also others as well. Another example is ensuring that, or another example that we saw was relationships that are operating at a senior level rather than just the operational level or on a project level. So this reflects where mana whenua or Māori organisations or runaka have senior people involved in regular contact or regular formal meetings with senior leadership within councils as well. Down here in Ōtepoti, it's been described as mana-to-mana relationships. Elsewhere, it works differently, or that language is different. But the idea is that if you've got the seniority there, then you've got mutual respect, you've got the right people at the table, the people who have the mana to be there and to make decisions, and there's information sharing and so on in that as well. Some councils have developed Māori strategic frameworks to guide that relationship and expectations and priorities. Others have had dedicated appointments at a senior level or at a strategic level to shape partnership working or relationship working with mana whenua. New appointment processes have required a higher level of kind of cultural capability of recruits working within Māori spaces. So that's been specified in a requirement of any new appointment within council to try to build that cultural acumen that I was talking about before. There's been a whole series of mechanisms for creating spaces for mana whenua involvement at the table that might be membership on committees with voting rights, some with voting rights, some without, but a space at the table nevertheless to be involved in those conversations that that are around shared interests in particular. And also, as Janet was talking about, the way in which mātauranga is informing mana whenua activities in relation to climate change. There's greater recognition of the value of that in local government as well that we saw, which is also a shift towards more just and robust working that we identified. Areas that need further support, clarity on the role of mana whenua and partnership working and the role of te tiriti in local government is really, really important. Again, referring back to the Future of Local Government report that came out and identified that as well. And then resourcing. This is really challenging. We know it's super challenging at the moment as well. But really all of these things that are working really well and that are creating change within that relationship space, but still need more to go, need resourcing and recognition. So building that cultural acumen across councils. We saw that some councils have initiated programs where all officers are engaging in a course or a program in a local education institute to build knowledge on te ao Māori and te reo. That kind of thing still needs resourcing and support. Mana whenua representation and compensating for the time and mahi that they're putting in and contributing to making better decisions at the local level. Strategic appointments need resourcing. Relationship building takes time, effort and energy, but is really important. Resourcing the ability to understand local histories of place. Janet was talking about that as well. And this last one around mātauaka, referring to Māori within an area who might not be mana whenua to that area, and the relationship that they have with councils versus the relationship that mana whenua have, because those things are different, but actually how do we acknowledge that within those spaces as well. And then lastly, alternate funding models. So we found in one instance, and this was referring back to the structure of local government, a funding project that really ended up treating treating mana whenua, although the intent was and all the goodwill from council was to ensure that that the project was co-designed, that it was a partnership working on a restoration project. The outcome was that really mana whenua were treated as contractors because the funding was assumed to go to the local authority. So finding alternate funding mechanisms that can actually create opportunities for mana whenua to have that rangatiratanga that Janet was talking about, but still be working with local government in a partnership way, but assuming that local government might not be the senior partner in every instance, and that being reflected in the funding mechanisms that come through as well. Next slide, please, Janet. Okay, so moving away from that specific relationship between mana whenua and local governments, we also found that local government was collaborating much more across the board. Graydon alluded to this a little bit, but in terms of what we found that was happening with our participants, there was lots of evidence of increased collaboration between district councils, between district and city councils, and regional councils as well. And this was reflected in things like climate change staff forums, in which information was shared, or there was shared resourcing for some of the auditing processes that were going on, and that kind of thing. And so this was kind of a little different from previous models where often councils end up, competing with one another, or competing over resourcing, or litigation, all of those things. So much more joined up working across the board was really evident and spoken about by our participants. That also extended to local authorities working with other organisations. The Ministry for the Environment, for example, working with Ngā Rauru Kitahi in relation to their climate strategy as well. Crown Research Institutes, NIWA working with groups to help support finer grained risk assessments and modelling for climate and so on. And also working with universities on research projects. Like here, we've had a long association with the Dunedin City Council and the Otago Regional Council here at Otago, and that's been really fruitful for both organisations as well. And then Janet was talking about some of those partnership working opportunities in relation to Māori organisations too. There's also collaboration between local authorities and communities. This is reflected in examples of community-led adaptation, and often these have been supported by adaptation funds, contestable funds that are available for community groups to engage in specific adaptation work. But also it's reflected in partnerships, for example, with where relationships have been built between the council and community organisations. So an example is the South Dunedin Futures Project, working really closely with the South Dunedin Community Network. And this is a relationship that they've developed and nurtured over many years now, which has provided a really strong connection across community and local authority in that particular project and area. Again, what further support is needed. Resourcing keeps coming up, but also sharing experiences on what works. There's a number of networks and that provide the opportunity to share these experiences. But again, resourcing those is really important to maintain them, and for it not to be just one more extra thing that takes a huge amount of work to facilitate. Research funding is also another mechanism by which that kind of resourcing can happen, where information is shared, what works is documented and explored and then shared further, as well, as really important in this space as we're working on this journey in responding to climate change. And then resourcing Māori organisations and building community capacity to collaborate as well. Janet, next slide, please. The last piece of this community, this relationships with local authorities sort of segment of the talk today is around community engagement. And what we've found through this project and previous projects and other work is that there's been quite a big shift in the way local authorities approach community engagement. So in the past, often community engagement is limited to the formal processes or the statutory processes around submissions or plan making, the plan processes, policy making, sometimes specific projects, and often the project is quite well developed, or some options for it are quite well developed, and they're put out there for feedback. It's kind of episodic, it's not based on building relationships. And what we've found over the years is that because climate change is different, the impacts are significant, it's long-term, there's going to be a whole series of different impacts over time that are uneven in the way they're distributed amongst communities and amongst people and organizations and environments and infrastructure. And so what's needed is actually good relationships with communities to make sure that decisions are responsive to community need and community context. And because it's place-based, as Janet indicated earlier, that's really, really crucial. So what we've found in this space is that there's been a bit of a shift, and this is reflected in what came through in our research around a shift towards community engagement being based on respect and building trust and building relationships for the longer term, and so that communities and councils are ready to make some of those harder decisions together that need to be made. So what we're seeing is local government working to understand the communities that they're needing to work with, and what those relationships are, what the past relationships are that inform the present ones, and working to acknowledge if there's been missteps in the past that have affected levels of trust and respect, and how to work and build from that. Community engagement is understood to be part of a long-term set of relationships that need to be nurtured and built. That means constant communication, kind of humanizing some of those relationships as well. And that requires resourcing engagement, and often resourcing specialist knowledge. So that's one of the things that we saw in our research as well, where specialist community engagement officers have been appointed and have done amazing work in those spaces as well. Part of that understanding communities is also meeting communities where they're at. All communities and even groups within communities are at different stages within this journey, and that means that they need to kind of start from where they're at, or else they're going to be left behind, or they're going to disengage, and that's really important. And that takes time and resource and some skill as well. Graydon mentioned not reinventing the wheel, or partnering with existing community groups and organisations is a really important part of that as well. So working with groups that are already there, part of meeting communities where they're at, going out to meet them and to talk with them as part of that process too. And then we've also, elsewhere, we've written about drawing on community development principles, and we've been seeing that in our work as well moving forward. What further support is needed? One of the key things, and Graydon's already mentioned this, we're going to mention it again, is that the legislative deficiencies or the gaps that are existing around the mandate for specific kinds of climate adaptation work for local authority to engage in means that there's a risk of either litigation because there's no mandate, or there's a risk of breaching trust that's been developed, and that might be tenuous because there's a need to go back on a decision or an indication that's been made as something's shifted. So not having enough certainty really affects the level of trust that you can build, and having that legislative framework in place that's really clear and provides that certainty and that pathway enables more confidence and more certainty around the decision-making pathways. And that's really important to have clear, so that you can have that really effective community engagement that builds trust and doesn't end up going back and undoing what's been done and all that hard work and resource that's gone into it. Again, resourcing for all of these things is a really big piece of work, and it takes time, effort, and energy, and skill as well. So building community relationships, engaging with those communities, especially those more susceptible to harm who are harder to reach, and also drawing in specialist expertise is all part of that resourcing picture as well. And then sharing success stories of doing engagement differently. So shifting engagement from that episodic, we've got all the information, we've got the project ready, we just need to get feedback on it to make sure we're on the right track, This is very different from that. So thinking about being bold and doing that differently as part of that, and sharing success stories to enable confidence in moving forward in that different space. And then lastly, we've produced this little document here that's in the top right corner, Community Engagement for Climate Adaptation. It's kind of, it was a piece of work that was done for the South Dunedin Futures Project that encapsulates some of these principles around shifting engagement as well. Next slide, please, Jana. Okay, so just sort of moving into wrapping this up in the next couple of minutes. We've talked about, Janet talked about just and robust adaptation right at the beginning. And this has framed all of our thinking in terms of what we've been pulling out as these, or what we've been talking to people about as these kind of, these innovations that people are engaging in, and why we think they're so fabulous, and why we think they're really kind of worth highlighting as ways of moving forward. And that's because they encapsulate aspects of what we've described as just and robust adaptation. And this document here, again, it's in the chat, draws from just adaptation literature, justice theories, and it provides some guidelines for thinking at quite a high level of how we can bring justice thinking and robust decision-making into climate change adaptation. Next slide, please, Janet. So just to encapsulate what we mean by these things really quickly, and also to recognise that these two things, just and robust, and we say them quickly together for a reason, because they are entangled and they require each other. But we can separate out some characteristics of each. So we think of robust decisions as being decisions that can account for uncertainty and complexity in the current moment, that are informed by broad knowledge, as Graydon was talking about, including mātauranga, as Janet was talking about, decisions are robust when they are embedded in relation to climate change, when they're embedded across an organisation. Graydon was talking a little bit about that as well. They have to be long-term. We're not just talking LTP processes or the kind of political cycle. We're actually talking about the sort of, 30 years, 50 years, 100 years hence, these long-term decision-making. They're collaborative. They have holistic outcomes that provide mutual benefits, not just addressing a specific response to a particular climate impact, but actually have broader benefits for society and environments, and that they operate within an enabling regulatory framework, which, as we've indicated, is a piece of work that still needs work, and we know you all know this too. And then they're just, of course, when they meet obligations under Te Tiriti o Waitangi, that they address structural inequities. And what we mean by structural inequities is those inequities that are the result of social, political, economic systems in society. They're often intergenerational, and it means that people are not starting from a level playing field, that playing field is very uneven, and it's often intergenerational. And so it means that some people are more susceptible to harm, and we need to address that. Distributive and procedural justice are embedded within that as well. And then obviously intergenerational justice, and justice that considers non-humans as well. Next slide, please, Janet. Last slide. Second last slide. But what we're suggesting is, although there are these examples that are really innovative and exciting and trying to do things differently in a challenging environment, we still need that strong resourcing and support for rangatiratanga and Māori-led responses, as Janet was talking about. We also need that legislative framework. We need the clarity on funding mechanisms that provide certainty for the future, the resourcing for managed retreat and infrastructure, and the clarity around private property rights, as Graydon was talking about, and existing use rights. And we need that clear indication of the allocation of responsibilities for local government within this space. We also need to encourage and support partnerships between those place responsible authorities that Janet was talking about, and we need resourcing as well across the board, as we've suggested, but specifically for mana whenua representation and working in local government, for those collaborative initiatives to support them, because they support efficiencies and better decisions in the longer term, and also for community engagement as well. Last slide, Janet. And we'll open it and throw it back to Zoe to manage our questions, and leave you with this wonderful quote from Te Kahui Ororu in the beautiful picture there as well. Thank you.
Kia ora, Sophie, and thank you to the team for sharing all your findings. We have one question in the Q&A function at the moment, but we've got a bit of time, so I wondered actually it was from Tom. I might allow you to ask the question directly if I just can find you, and you should have the ability to speak, Tom, if you're there. So
Yeah, I'm here.
Perfect. Yeah, if you wanted to answer your question directly to the team.
Yeah, no worries. I was just wondering whether, obviously these sort of discrete research projects, whether as part of the engagement and the ongoing throughout these things, whether there'd been any thought or any identification of opportunities to carry some of these connections on and what that might look like. And I just put in there, obviously the Aotearoa Society of Adaptation Professionals, which is in its infancy at this point in time, but also organisations like Roika Mangai, and how we might carry some of these things forward. So I'm wondering, yeah, if you saw any sort of opportunities for that, or had any thoughts or any ideas in that space. Kia ora.
Kia ora, thanks, Tom, and great to have you here. I suppose my response would be that we're very always very happy and keen to share or give presentations to any other groups, and share obviously all the documents and things that we've produced from this. In terms of further work from here, yeah, the funding environment right at the moment isn't looking too positive for initiatives of this kind, and obviously our fingers are crossed that some things may emerge out of the woodwork, but we would love to do more work with the mana whenua groups we've worked with across this and other projects. We would love to work more with professionals in councils and other locations, because this is just going to keep going. We're on a trajectory of worsening impacts, and we're nowhere near ready as a nation or as communities to deal with these. So it's going to be a space that needs so much more work in it and so much more collaboration. And I think as a team, anything we can do to help, we'd be pleased to assist with. I don't know if Sophie or Graydon's got anything to add to that.
Yeah, Graydon.
Tom, I might follow up with you offline about some potentials for at least the next year. I feel like that's all the funding certainty I have at the moment. So
yeah, cool. Okay.
Yeah. And I think I'd just add that, particularly in our context here in Ōtepoti, we've got as I said, great relationships with the DCC and the ORC, and they're doing some really interesting and innovative work, not just in South Dunedin, but also elsewhere as well. So I think, because we're here and we've got those relationships, we'll maintain that. We'll obviously seek funding to try to, grow that, but in the absence of it, there may be little bits that we can do even, as we're moving forward. So
that's true.
And keen. We'll probably try and do it on the smell of an oily rag instead. Perhaps not oily.
I guess, yeah, and one thing we can offer actually is access to young people who are really keen to further their studies with pieces of sort of small research work that can directly support communities or projects or councils.
Yeah, that is something that is worth mentioning in terms of postgraduate theses and things like that. We're often working with students who do that work, and that still becomes available as well. So keep an eye out for that. In fact, our archive, the Otago University Research Archive that the link is on for here, often have theses and information available from research from students. That's really good in this space.
Thank you, Tom, for your question and for allowing me to put you in the spotlight slightly. I'll put you back into the pack. Please those of you who's here, throw any questions into the chat or the QA function, or raise your hand, and we'll get that to our speakers today. I have a few questions I noted down through your talking, so I'll ask one which is quite actually more, I suppose, research specific, but speaks, I think, maybe to the people you were working with. I noticed very early on you talked about place responsible authorities as the people you were kind of working with, and I wondered if that term was something you'd come up with yourself, and how sort of mana whenua and local government, whether that term spoke to them, they sort of identified with it.
Yeah, I guess it's a phrase that we dreamed up when we were developing the bid. We don't tend to use it very much when we're talking to these groups. It's a little bit academic probably, but we just wanted to reinforce the message that kind of often there's an assumption that, you know, given any geographical space, there's, you know, a regional council and a city council who have responsibilities there that are laid down in legislation, and they carry those out. But at the same time, there's another layer of responsibility that is there for mana whenua, that is ongoing for place and the people of that place, and that we cannot ignore that, and in fact we need to bring that much more to the awareness of everybody who's working in this climate adaptation space.
Thank you, Janet. I think maybe somebody's hand is up, but I'm just having a look to see who it was. A question I think that everyone has front of mind. Oh, Graydon. No, you were just testing that. Okay. I'll keep looking for the hand up. About resourcing, you've sort of spoken to a little bit of that you have postgrads on hand potentially that you can get activated in the space. Do you have any other inspiration on where this much needed resourcing could come from?
Can I just say that a little resourcing can go a very long way in our experience? And so, you know, an example was one of the iwi groups we were working with in the Bay of Plenty, who got, I think it was like $15,000 to commission from a regional council to commission a piece of work looking at the implications of sea level rise for their lands, where they've got close to 130 people living on land which is very susceptible to both flooding and sea level rise in coming years. And it was that work, I mean, that's a relatively small amount of money in a overall council budget, but it completely stimulated and created the basis for a real turnaround in how that community was seeing its future, and has really stimulated a series of steps which now has that entire community, that kainga, coming together to discuss their future on that land. And that so the key thing is, it's not sometimes about the quantum, but the tangible regularity of that being available over time, i.e. that it's not just available once, but that there is always going to be a consistent availability of this kind of funding to help these initiatives get off the ground.
Sophie or Graydon, do you have anything to add to that?
I could, I mean, I think, I guess going along with that sort of a little goes a long way. It's also about, I think, thinking longer term. I think there's the allocation of funding is about prioritizing it in different ways and recognizing the broader benefits, like Janet was saying, of, you know, a particular project has a whole series of other spin-offs that generate momentum or generate energy, or can even generate further funding or partnerships that create efficiencies. So sometimes I think it's also thinking differently about what is prioritized. I don't want to say I'm not saying do more with less at all. That's not it at all. It's more about thinking about what those priorities might be, and perhaps being a bit bolder about justifying where and how money is spent within this space as well. Yeah. Maybe it's being creative in a funding constrained environment as well, and brave.
Great. And do you have anything to add on that? Otherwise, I actually have a build-on question, I think, for something Sophie said, but I think relates to this. I was interested in the mention of alternative sort of funding models, and maybe a little bit around the kind of power dynamics that can shift. Did you sort of, interested to hear more about your thoughts on that front, and whether you'd observed any or just observed places where it wasn't working?
It was more about where it wasn't working and thinking about what the implications are for making assumptions about where money sits and how money is managed on projects that are joint working projects. So this applied, this particular case was that I was referring to was a restoration project between mana whenua and the council, but it also applies elsewhere in terms of working with communities or community groups or organizations, or it's the assumption that we make an assumption based on an organization who can hold a budget and provide the accountabilities that are expected and that kind of thing, and it undermines trust in relation to the other organizations that might also have the ability and capacity to or develop the ability and capacity, which provides other spin-offs to hold that money and manage that money in a different way, rather than assuming that the university holds it or the council holds it because they're big organizations that can do that stuff and have done it in the past. It immediately creates a relationship of a senior partner and a junior partner, or a contractor and a contractee. And that's very different from, shared power, if you like. In relation to that. So I guess that was the point, and it kind of, for me, it highlighted the structures that we work within that are assumed to be normal and natural, and it's also tied into timelines and things like that too, whereas we can do things differently, and sometimes it just means thinking outside the box and proposing something and trying it to see if it's going to work.
Thank you, Sophie. If Janet or Graydon have anything to add on that, you'd be welcome to. We've one more call for anyone who may want to ask a question. Otherwise, we'll, I think, shift to the sort of wine. Oh, yes, Sophie was.
Oh, just there's a question from Rob Dunn in the chat.
Oh, okay, in the chat. Perfect.
Q&A. No, Q&A, sorry, not the chat.
Well,
I'll
I'll just read this out. Have you explored international funding opportunities to support the connection of your great work with an example?
Great.
Yeah.
Thank you, Rob. I wasn't aware of that.
They will be exploring it now.
Yeah. Actually, I'll just put a plug in actually for if this audience, given this audience has a climate adaptation interest, in 2025, so October next year, there's a United Nations conference on climate adaptation, which is being held in New Zealand, in Canterbury, hosted mainly by Canterbury University, but also assisted by other organisations. And that is a global conference on climate change adaptation, but with a particular focus on, I guess, the Southern Hemisphere and Oceania. And so that's a sort of a shout out to everybody just to be aware that's coming. And there will be calls for papers and contributions, and a real interest in having a great New Zealand audience there, either virtually or in person.
Wonderful. I think we have time maybe for any final closing thoughts from each of you. You can go around the circle, maybe one core message that you'd take away from this research project. I'll go for Graydon first, and then Janet, and then Sophie, and then we'll close off.
Thanks, Zoe. just riffing off Tom's comment, the last slide really emphasises things we've known for a while, provide good evidence for the adaptation framework inquiry. Couldn't agree more. So much, when I was doing the interviews with council staff, so many of them said, we're just waiting on central government. We're waiting on the Climate Adaptation Act. We needed this confirmed 5-10 years ago. So it really comes down to political decision making, right? Yeah. So let's all submit. Just keep emphasising, eh? Thanks.
Yeah, and I just on that, I did put up a slide that had the submission collectively that we put mainly from our Māori partners to the earlier version of the climate adaptation inquiry that's going through to this one, and hopefully we get an opportunity to actually speak to that as well. So absolutely, there's a real vacuum in that space, a leadership vacuum, which at the moment is being taken up by all of these wonderful innovations by mana whenua organisations, by councils, but the central government really has to pick up the game and act now to complement that really great groundswell of work being done out in the regions.
And I haven't got anything more than that to add, because that's exactly what I was going to say as well. But also, I think the other thing that's really struck me in this work is really often it's the work and the vision and the energy of individuals that are really driving some of this stuff. And sometimes that's sort of over time, and those individuals pass on their passion and wisdom and effort, and it gets transferred through an organization as you know, this is thinking not just the 2 years of our project, but over the last sort of maybe 5 to 8 years or so. And I guess it's just like, you know, that work is hard, especially in the absence of that legislative mandate. And so I want to acknowledge that and celebrate that, and also say, yeah, keep going, kia kaha, let's get this submissions happening to try to really push as much as we possibly can in the current context. And be brave, keep being brave, bold.
Be brave, creative, and innovative.
Absolutely.
Thank you all for joining us today, attendees. Thank you, team, for sharing your research and producing these really, I think, usable resources as well that you're sort of presented on. I will, when we send out the recording to attendees, we can also include some of these resources, so everyone should have access to that. I'm just going to finish with a karakia, and then we will be done for the day. Te mauri o te hui, kaia. Te mauri o te wānanga, kaia. Koia ki ranga, koia ki raro. Haumie, huie.